as of the writer. Hence the art. But that said, I think that the conversation that I hope we have here today is partly me asking you both of you to reflect on things that I know you face as writers, but as fiction writers primarily, but also me asking you some questions that I've always been curious about, because there are a lot of questions about how the editing side of things works for fiction that I'm curious about, and I've never put them to writers in a setting like this where I can really put you guys on the spot and pick your brains, so watch out. So I think to start with, I think maybe, Chandrahas, if I may, I'll start with you. Just to ask you, you used to be the fiction editor at The Caravan, a magazine based in Delhi, where I also used to work, and I was a copy editor at the time, and so we were collaborating quite a bit on all the fiction that was coming out each month. I just wanted to ask you to think back on those days and maybe reflect on what working as a fiction editor did to how you write fiction.
Okay. Well, hello to everybody. I meant to ask, is everyone comfortable with English? Yes, that's fine. Because many of the other sessions are Nepali out there now, but so if you need, I can say some things in Hindi, but if English is fine, then.
Nepali language is necessary here.
I know it's necessary, but. The only thing is I'm unable to provide that need personally, so English is fine, that's great. Okay, well, it's very nice for me to see two people who used to live, a few kilometers from me in Delhi for many years, so it's just like meeting together in a bar, except there's an audience this time. Makes it even nicer.
A bit early for that too.
I think all of us fiction writers learn how to write fiction by editing the fiction of the books that we read. You say, that is lovely, how did a writer achieve this effect? Why do these sentences sound so beautiful? How is this sense of structure making meaning in a way that enhances what the story is doing? And I started out in books as a literary critic in my 20s, and I found it very fun work. I've written a book which is available in the shop outside, My Country's Literature, which is essentially 60 or 70 essays about writers I love a lot, and trying to show how every writer's specific sense of style, theme, tone makes their work meaningful. And the art of being a reader, essentially not very different from the art of editing fiction, is having the receptor to pick up what the transmitter is saying. That is when literature reaches its greatest heights, because it is one person, sometimes for 400 or 500 years away, speaking into your ear on a dark night somewhere, in a place that the writer could never have imagined. And that's where the transaction of fiction takes place. And once I had published my first book, and I was enough of a name in India to at least be known by a few other people, when Caravan very unusually wanted to start this fiction, Caravan, the Indian monthly, they wanted to start a fiction writing section. They wrote to me, and I thought, one sad thing is the South Asian literary landscape has expanded hugely in 20 years, but one sad thing, at least in English, is that magazine publication of short stories has disappeared almost entirely. Sometimes it has been replaced by print online journals. In India, at least, there's Out of Print, which is run by 2 or 3 very passionate people in Bangalore. If any of you are young writers, that is a place to submit to. What a young writer wants, it is very difficult. I think I'd like to know your thoughts on this, Janice. It's very difficult to make the step up from being a non-writer to a writer by yourself in one leap, no matter how hard you try. Somebody else's eye, just saying you are trying too hard here, these 2 sentences are not required, gives you a sense of the order that lies inside yourself, but which you cannot perceive. That is the whole, it's the same with people, I don't exactly know how I come across as a person. Somebody else has to tell me, you are too loud, you're too soft. This is as good as it gets. This is the right place for this thing to have arrived. And I recall some names who are now very well-known Indian writers who went through the caravan in that way. You know, Tanuj Solanki, Manu Bhattacharya, these all published first in the caravan. And that is the job of a magazine. Janice, you had the story out too. I look back on those years with some fondness because it was like having a little literary festival on a month-by-month basis where people spoke through their work. You didn't have to speak about it. Your stories were who you were.
Janice, this story that Chandras was talking about, if you could share.
Yes, of course. I think you're so right, Chandras, about the fact that when you're a young writer and you don't quite know how to really put your work out there, the space of the magazine literary pages is just incredibly, incredibly important. And I say this because my first 2 short stories were published in the caravan, one with Rajni and one with Chandrahas. And I can't tell you the joy of seeing your name in print, the words that you've toiled over in some, small room at your desk, thinking, who is going to read this and why am I doing this, right? These are the questions that writers ask themselves every day. Why am I doing this? And for that to land in that kind of space, to have the structural support of not just the form of the magazine, but an editor who has looked at your work, has edited your work, has helped you make that story better, there's nothing really that can replace that, I think. I also remember, Chandrahas, that alongside the fiction pieces, alongside the stories, there was space for a critical reflection. So there was a bit of writing on the writing. And I thought that also is just such an important space to bolster the fiction, to think about writing. Why are we writing the way we write? Why are we telling the kinds of stories that we're telling at this point in time? Why are these stories relevant? Why is this author relevant, right? So there's a whole going to happen now. I feel like we all also shouldn't sit here and be all doom and gloom about it. It's a time when hopefully other spaces will open up. But I owe so much to the caravan because it heard me as a young writer and published my stories.
No, absolutely. And I think, Chandrahas, when you were talking about why you were excited to take on that role as somebody who was working more as a critic and writing your own work, you said the chance to help. And I think that, as an editor, I think that is so much the privilege of the job. The chance to discover, of course, I still remember some of those absolute gems that just land in your inbox out of the blue, but also then to really help and to sublimate yourself in a way to the fiction writer. I think that probably in fiction that's much more important than in nonfiction. So I wanted to maybe just go through some of maybe we can call it the mechanics of it. One thing I remember, for instance, when we were working together, when I was looking more at the language as a copy editor, was always, and I think this is a reflection of my own, I guess, tastes in fiction as well, and of course you bring some of your personality to the work. I was always obsessed with the clarity of the image, where if a writer is trying to communicate something, I'm trying to be the most forgiving reader, but still a strict reader, trying to see if the image that they seem to be going for is actually coming through clearly to me. And that was one of those technical things that I was always, I don't know if technical is the right word for it, but one of those things that I was always watching out for and trying to always push the writer to do that much better in terms of just realizing what they wanted to communicate. I wanted to ask if there are other things, whether as an editor or also as somebody who is being edited as a fiction writer, if there are things like that you really find helpful, if there are things that you really appreciate that the editor is looking out for. But also the flip side, where is that line where suddenly the editor starts to encroach into your territory?
I don't recall having a lot of, strangely enough, many of the disputes with writers in the caravan days tended to be over another sad a problem of journalism in South Asia tended to be about the payments not arriving rather than the words being messed around with on time. And this is when you felt embarrassed to be accepting a salary that would arrive every month when, the person whom you have on good faith
Completely agree.
These are other complications of fiction writing in India, the economic side of things, But in general, I kind of felt, because I was already a published writer, among the younger writers, there was a slight sense of deference, which is useful sometimes. In the conversation was very easy, and among older writers, one also felt they'd earned their right to even make mistakes, if you will. Editing in fiction, like you say, is much more subjective, and the problem with trying to overrule somebody and standing your ground with the other person, you can only hope to persuade the other person, but if they stand their ground too, you should always give way, I feel, because it is disrespectful otherwise to say that you somehow know something better than they do, coming from the same space of creation. So I think these are the delicacies and intricacies involved, but because we publish such a range of writers, and sometimes, like in your case, Janice, I think one of the stories we published already came perfectly formed, it was going to come out in a book, so it was only a matter of selecting the best one so that our readers would enjoy reading it too. It was on the whole very pleasurable, and if anything, you found yourself learning something, even from young writers, rather than giving something to them. There's something great about being a young writer. If you really love literature and are not very pretentious about it, you have something specific to your voice that is almost unduplicatable. And in that way, even as you are still giving as you are receiving from other people. And that is the tradition of literature, that this is where, you feel you cannot afford to be selfish as a writer. It's only in keeping the entire system healthy and alive by allowing everybody to flourish, including now, in all the Indian languages in translation. The biggest world you can make is the world where you are the most likely to be happy. But sometimes, sadly, the problem in fiction writing, it's become increasingly a smaller space. It's very competitive now because it's a very small pool. And it's not as if it is a pathway to great financial prosperity either. So sometimes you end up into spaces where you would prefer not to be. In the main, I think what I really appreciate about Editing at the Caravan was that it was a mainly non-fiction magazine of reportage in which every month there was a lead character, a great, Modi, Amit Shah, whatever. There would be a reportage is not the only way of learning how to make sense of the world. And beautifully ordered language, a story about, a hamlet in a small village can reveal what is, the truth of a society as much as a government program on which millions of crores are being spent. And that was the pleasure, I think, being part of it. That's why it's fun to publish in, occasionally Mint publishes these newspaper editions where you can have stories. It's nice to encroach or invade the non-fiction space, because otherwise it's so dull, there's only so far that journalism can go. And even journalism needs to be kept honest. So much of Indian journalism is, may reveal some facts, but it's, I always cringe when I see these Times of India editorials, which there hasn't been even enough sub-editing. The I's are a small case. I said this, I said that, etc. That's us. When language can slip into this state, it needs fiction to remind yourself that, integrity of language is the path to integrity of thought. And so in all these ways, I think, that's why you feel passionate for fiction. That's why that's the flag we have to continue bearing for fiction, even in a non-fiction age.
Oh, absolutely. There's really nothing more to add to what Chandra has just said, and I just agree so wholeheartedly. But maybe then I can focus a little bit on craft. So my relationship to editing is twofold. So I am my own editor to begin with, which is a very contentious relationship, and difficult and fraught, but also rewarding, I would hope, at some level. I think I spoke about this a little bit yesterday, so for those of you who were in the audience, forgive the repetition. But I really do work as an editor when I'm editing my own writing at the level of sound. Because I come from Shillong and I come from a very vibrantly oral storytelling community, what's important for me is how language sounds on the page, right? It reads a certain way, but for me, it has to sound well to my ear. So I'm editing at that very granular language level, and I'm looking at a sentence and how it's constructed, but also how it falls in rhythm and pace, how it falls on the page, how it stops when I need to take a breath. So my body and my breath is linked to the language on a page. So when I'm editing my writing, I'm really editing at that level, as well as, of course, is any of this serving what I'm trying to do? Is the story being served by what's on the page? My relationship with my editor in a publishing house is obviously different, but I think we're very fortunate when we find someone who we can work with and with whom we develop this kind of incredible rapport. I think we have so many stories of legendary relationships between, friendships between writers and editors across the world through the ages. And I can begin to understand why. It is a very rare kind of pleasure. It's also a space of great trust and great vulnerability, because you are actually placing your work in the hands of this person, and both of you are in that vulnerable space. You both occupy that space, and you need to trust the editor that they will give you the best possible feedback, and the editor needs to trust you that you will be receptive to the feedback that they offer. So it's a very delicate balance. It's a very delicate kind of friendship. And I've noticed that with good editors, for me at least, is that they ask very good questions. So they're not prescriptive in the sense of, oh, do this, do that, and a list of things that they think will make your writing better. I think that's a very top-down, rather boring way to enliven a text. I think my favorite editors tend to be the ones who ask questions. Why have you done this? And have you thought about this? And why is this character using this word? And a good editor forces you to think through your own literary decisions on the page. And I think that makes you a better writer, but it also makes you a better editor yourself, because you acknowledge that the only way to make a text more effective, to craft in a way that is more effective, is to begin to ask yourself good questions about the story that you're trying to tell. Yeah?
I think that's so on point. And I think, a piece of advice, I guess, that I got from a literature editor, a fiction editor, actually, who said that writing is rewriting. And I think that that's absolutely true. And an editor is fundamentally doing the same work that a writer is doing for themselves. It's just that you have a friend to do it with, which counts for a lot. And I'm so grateful that you said that as well, because I think that's such an important part of the larger project of fiction writing. I think, we started our conversation talking about short stories, magazines, and of course there is a short-term relationship that you forge with any writer that you work with, but then embarking upon something as ambitious as a novel, where oftentimes you don't know where you're going, you just take the first step on faith. What role does the editor play in that? And I'm talking about not the technicalities. I mean, there's the questions, and you're absolutely right to ask smart questions about what your characters are doing and whether that's consistent with everything else your characters are doing, for instance. But beyond that, on a more personal level, if I can push you, Janice, to also speak about this, but also Chandrahas, because I mean, you've produced your share of novels as well, and I'm sure that the emotional struggle of that and the editor's role in that much longer term relationship. What happens when you move from editing a short story to editing a novel and working alongside somebody on something of that scale?
Janice, you go, because by having first stab at every question, I end up, taking up stuff that you probably also want to say.
And I think this follows on from what you were already saying as well.
Well, it's very tricky to begin with. If only because it is a long-term relationship. A novel takes a year, 2 years, sometimes to see the editing through. And so the trust and the respect and the vulnerability, all of them in some ways are amped up, right? I think though that what a good editor of a piece of long fiction, of a novel, for me, is someone with a vision. Someone who is able to look at your book, to look at your manuscript, because that's all that it is at that point, and say, I think it can be this much better, and I think that you can push this, and I think that you can try that. And these are not easy, bits of advice, because often I sit there and I think, he's absolutely wrong, and I have no idea what he's saying, and I'm not going to do this. And I feel very resistant to that kind of quite intrusive, I don't know if that's the right word, but that kind of intervention rather, right? It's not easy because you've spent a lot of time working on this manuscript, years, 5, 6 years sometimes, and it becomes such an intrinsic part of you that it's almost as though they're editing you, that they're saying something about you, and that you have somehow failed and not really, done the best that you could on the page. But I think once you put that aside, you put that little bit of ego, that little bit of, vulnerability aside, and you say, okay, let me think about this. And then you see, annoyingly, he might have had a point. So it's really that kind of negotiation, of resistance sometimes, of receptivity sometimes, of very many conversations. I don't think that that conversation ever truly ends in some way, because you try and build that editorial writerly relationship, I think, beyond just one book. I think that's actually much more long-term. Even one book is not long-term enough, I think. But I really do feel that it comes down to what kind of vision the editor has for your book. And it might be sometimes a vision that you hadn't quite imagined. But it makes your book that much more luminescent and that much more powerful. And you have to be able to trust the editor, again, back to trust, that what they're seeing might not have been in your field of vision to begin with, but that they are seeing something there that you hadn't. And that's very tricky, because you take that leap and you say, okay, I'm going to try and we'll see how this goes. And sometimes it really does help to know that, as you said, you have a friend, that they're there to see it through. So for me, a long-term relationship is actually not just about one book. It's about building that kind of trust over several, if not many, many books.
You could decide to move once with them and find them moved on once again. And, so it was impossible in this game of musical chairs to keep up. And I've had 3 editors for my 3 novels, and I feel envious when you speak about this, Janice, because I can't recall having that depth of engagement with any one person with my work. Unless when I'm in writing nonfiction, that's sometimes been very pleasurable, pieces and stuff. But the bit of editing that I really look forward to, and for any of you who want to try writing fiction seriously, I should tell you there's 2 aspects of creativity in fiction. Composition is one, which is the more glorified bit. There's nothing more creative than editing your own work. There's nothing more fulfilling, in fact. I mean, I dread composition many days. Looking at that blank page, you know that whatever you're going to write, no matter how inspired you are, is probably not going to be good enough to be published. But coming back to it, sitting down over it, learning to cut little bits out of it, improve a sentence, that's really fun work, because the stress of building something up is gone, and you're only now trying to polish. And during caravan years, the most stressful relationships, since we're talking about that, Roman, were not with the writers who would get published. It was writing the letters of rejection to the writers the dozens of writers who would send in stories. Because only one story a month, 12 a year. You couldn't say yes to everybody, well-intentioned though they may have been. And sometimes you could so clearly see in what somebody had sent you, which they expected you to spend half an hour or 1 hour of your time reading, that they not even bothered to read it a second time. You've seen the Janice as well. You know, there are writers like that who are so confident of their majesty as a creator that they don't even feel that, you know, I know published writers in India who say, I never read my own work once I'm done with it. What a tragedy, I mean, but anyway. And sometimes writing back to folk like that, you'd actually feel bad for somebody because they've lost the chance to enjoy their own work. So desperate are they. And this is a big problem in India, I think, you know, which we should somehow caution people against. You know, the pleasure of getting published is nothing compared to the embarrassment of looking at your own work and realizing that it's not good enough. Seriously. So you might as well wait another year or two. And in this sense, I think the best editors I ever had were my two best friends I went to college with for 10 years in Delhi. I used to live next door to them. But I was living in Bombay in my 20s, and I wanted to write a novel, and I spent some years writing Arzi the Dwarf. I was very pleased the day it was done, and I took a train up to Delhi, and you know, I printed it all out in the local cyber cafe, and I gave it to them, and I said, I will not disturb you. Please read this and tell me what you think about it. And, you know, you try not to notice as you're sitting very seriously. You go back so many years, you're sitting very seriously, taking your work so seriously. And 2 or 3 days later, they sat me down and they said, we're sorry to say, it really isn't very good. I was crushed. And what could you say? I mean, your best friend's delivering this on you after all these years. And so, you know, I swallowed my disappointment and took this manuscript back and left it alone for a couple of months. And I looked at it again. I couldn't agree more with what they had said. This is the thing, you know, you can sometimes confuse the pleasure of creating with the pleasure of real achievement. It doesn't mean that what you did was wrong. It just means that there's some way to go. And if anything, that led to probably the greatest creative summer of my life. I noticed I laughed a few times during the book. It was meant to be a comedy. It clearly was trying too hard. But the little bits that I enjoyed were the bits I thought, well, if there's this difference, a clue to good editing is when a work is uneven, but there are little patches where it seems almost perfect. You know, there is something in there that is the right tone or the right compositional key. For the entire piece, it's just that the writer is either too unevolved or too lazy to produce that finish. But when you can have isolated that, which can be different for every writer, then you can grow big trees from these small plants, you know, and that then becomes really fun because you have evolved some principle that is organic to the book itself, and you will probably never need those resources again in your life, even in your creative life. You will use completely different principles for other books, but for that season, when after years of work you found the key, the real key, not these spiritual keys that keep on coming out in these, the real key to yourself. That is really, you know, then editing and creativity come together in a very nice rush.
Can I just add that
Please.
I teach at Ashoka University, and I don't know if I can say I teach creative writing. I still find it odd to say that because can you really teach creative writing? But that's a whole other session by itself. But I read a lot of student writing, and all of them, without fail, say that they hate going back to what they've written. And they feel that once it's written, it's done. And I tell them, that's a first draft. That's not done. But I think what the key to really good editing, I think, alongside your other keys, is that you have to have a lot of patience. And you have to kind of inculcate that discipline of going back to a text over and over again, even if it's really boring the hell out of you at some point. Eventually it will. And that's when you put it away, of course. But I find that this is what's missing sometimes, this rigor, this discipline of going back to a piece of writing to say, okay, how can I make this better? Because that requires a lot of patience, and everyone wants it done here and now and publish on Instagram, and it's done.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that that's something that translates whether it's fiction or non-fiction with any deep, immersive piece of writing. I mean, editing is so much about perspective, whether you're editing someone else or you're editing yourself. What you were just talking about in terms of leaving it alone for a few months and coming back, you read it with different eyes. And the editor's function, as whether it's fiction or anything else, the editor's function is to read it with a different set of eyes. Because when you're writing a piece or a novel, and I think sometimes editors also, when you've been deep in a piece for a very long time with an ambitious piece, you're seeing it so up close that you don't see the big picture. And that's really what the editor's job is. And also when you're editing yourself, you have to give yourself the time, the distance, the perspective to come back at it with, I guess, a stranger's eyes almost. And also what you were saying, Janice, I think, I know that this was a misconception that I labored under when I was a young reader. And I've realized in doing workshops with other aspiring young writers that this is actually something that runs quite deep. This misconception that your favorite book, whatever it might be, that somebody sat down and in one blaze of genius wrote every word perfect from start to finish, and that was it. And beating yourself up when what you produce on the page obviously doesn't work that way. And I think that somehow, because everything is presented in that way, of course, nobody wants to show you the guts of the work because it's not grand, it's not fun, oftentimes it is, oftentimes it isn't. It's not what you want to see, it's not what you want to buy when you buy a shiny new book off the shelf, so nobody's going to be telling you all of this, but that means that I think a lot of people come away thinking that that's how fiction or writing works, and maybe that's something for young and aspiring writers here to also remember. I think that your words and your view of it, from what you were saying, I think is so important for anybody who wants to get into writing their own work. I know we are also short on time, and I think maybe that was a little bit of advice to young writers, because I'm sure there are people in the audience here today who are thinking about writing something of their own. But maybe to round the session out, since we're already on this theme of advice, maybe I can ask the two of you, it doesn't have to be advice per se, but what was the best piece of wisdom you ever got from a fiction editor, and also the worst, for that matter, that might be of use? I mean, lessons, positive lessons and negative ones for anyone else who wants to dive into writing their own work.
Janice, I will let you start.
Well,
no names named, of course. Janice, please.
I mean, fortunately or unfortunately, I remember the worst piece of advice that I received from an editor who shall not be named.
Never.
Never. My lips are sealed. But this was when my first book of stories, short stories, was, I suppose, being circulated, at these publishing houses, and I was waiting for feedback. And one editor told me, I think you should write more like Anjum Hassan, who is this other writer in India. And I thought, maybe not, because I'm not Anjum Hassan. You shouldn't write as someone else or to be someone else. I mean, that really was quite the worst. The best, honestly, depends on book to book, story to story. It varies. What one piece of advice or a question for one story or one novel may not actually work for any other. So there's no sort of generic bit of advice that I can give you. But I really do think, going back to what Chandrahas was saying, to inculcate within the idea of editing the idea of revisioning, which is to keep something away for a while. So I would say that actually the best piece of advice that I did receive from my editor was, don't think about it. For 4 months or 5 months, don't think about it. Just let it be, so that you come back to a manuscript, to a piece of text, and you are able to revision it, which literally means to see with new eyes, right?
That is very well said. We're also so caught up with this cult of productivity and working hard that you feel if you finish writing your book and then you want to put it away, what are you going to do in the meantime? And it's in your head all the time. That distance allows you to come back to the book with the reader's eyes, and then you can be both reader and writer at the same time and begin to work from on top of it rather than from inside it. I don't know that I don't know if I ever got great advice, but what I really appreciate when I'm writing books is the company of my friends who are very good fiction writers. I mean, it's a roundabout kind of advice, but being in good quality company is a very, I've just, a close friend of mine. By the way, I should tell you a little secret. If you can get one good book written, suddenly lots of doors open out in the world, and lots of people then know you without having met you. And you have to some extent, you have the respect of your peers, including a lot of older people whom you otherwise would never have dreamt of ever approaching in a shop or in a festival saying, dear so-and-so, whatever. And I remember when I was 30, I met this Israeli writer who's now my best friend in books. I mean, and we tried to meet ever since then, once every 2 years in some common destination, and spend a week talking about books and art and films with nothing else to disturb us. And this is the most exciting week of my year, and I always come back full of ideas, including for the work that I've been doing myself for a while. And in this sense, I think more than specific advice, what the difficulty in being an artist is to make sure that your environment is aesthetically charged in some reliable way. Otherwise, life is too mundane, too routine, too difficult, to the bills, the taxes, the people wasting your time on WhatsApp or whatever it is. Somewhere to have some reliable source of, of making the air light up is the best advice or the best help you can give yourself. As for bad advice, I think, sadly, I think fiction, from what one can see, fiction is full of it. And probably as South Asian writers in English, we suffer from it more than some others, although we have many other advantages, because often we are represented and edited by people who are not from our culture. And I've often found, that's why I haven't had an agent for 5 years, and I almost feel more relieved writing that way. You know, I wrote a book, Days of My China Dragon, about a restaurant in Bombay where I could use I could say exactly what I wanted. I don't feel the pressure of having to explain things about my society to a reader who is a stranger to that world. And the questions are not exactly technical or aesthetic. They are more in the realm of, if someone says to you, this is too slow. On some occasions, I've interpreted that as meaning I cannot stay with you all the way for what I feel is a pretty important moment in the text. And in these ways, I think there is, for whatever reason, a kind of mistrust sometimes between writers and editors from different cultures. Sometimes it can also be wonderful, as with marrying somebody from another culture. The bits that work out actually make both of you bigger. But for the most part, it helps, I think, to reach a stage in your work where your first editor and the one who works hardest for you is yourself. And from then on, everything else, there are good things that come your way, and those can also take you higher.
I'd asked this question of another writer friend once, and they said that the best thing their editor ever told them was, "Are you really sure you want to do this?" And they said yes, and they produced a great book. But I think maybe that's also good advice to keep in mind. It's hard work.
It's a good question. I remember when I was 25, I once met the great Oriya painter Prafulla Manti at a show in Bombay, and he asked me, "What do you do?" I said, a bit presumptuously, "I'm a writer." He said, "Why do you want to write?" I said, this is quite direct, but it was great. You should, even in mid-career, you should ask yourself this question, and the answer, I believe, changes every few years as well.
And why do you want to write this? Why do you want to write the specific thing that you have there? I think we're out of time, but one last question, because again, I think that there are young writers here, I'm sure, who are thinking about, where do I start? Where do I take that first step? Chandrahas, you mentioned Out of Print in Bangalore, right?
Yes.
I think that that's a place where you can start your journey. You can submit your work and be edited, which I think is so important. I don't want to plug Himal, my own magazine, but we we publish fiction. Once a year, we do an online fiction festival. We're always open to submissions. This year, we're going to be doing something of fiction in South Asian languages in translation, which is another extremely important and extremely fascinating art as well. But also just wanted to leave that to you, the two of you, because I think you probably have a better sense of the landscape across South Asia. Where else, and not just in terms of short stories, even in terms of pitching novels, any for a first-time writer trying to break in, where do you think there are places where they can go knocking?
Well, there's the Bombay Literary Review as well, who actually take, you know, the art of editing very, very seriously, and they work across many mediums. So they work with photo essays and short stories and poetry. So it's quite an exciting space. There's one more which is called, there's something Quarterly, and it slips my mind now.
The Indian Quarterly, huh?
Is it the Indian Quarterly? That used to be there. I'm not quite sure whether it still exists.
I'm not sure they still exist.
Yeah,
Maybe not.
Yes.
So I guess the answer is not that many places.
There aren't that many, but actually, there's nothing to stop you from starting your own magazine. Unless your desire is only to publish your own work, and that is not a good enough reason. But, a very good way to learn editing for yourself is to edit other people's work. And there is something about magazines that intrinsically is about small-scale collective work from people who know each other. And it's a great way to learn many things about writing. And the other thing I would say to those of you who are young writers is that early on in your career, usually rejection is more valuable than acceptance, strange though it may sound. Anybody who can tell you a good reason for why your work does not reach a certain standard is presenting you with a tremendous piece of help on your own journey if it is specific enough for you to then be able to go back and review it. Whereas it would be so easy to, that's the sort of a magazine or framework which I believe the few years that we were all working in these spaces, that was what was good about it, that those who could submit 4 or 5 times, break through, knew that they had learned enough on the journey to then sort of take care of themselves. That is a space that you want to be a player in. And in these ways, I think perhaps we should finish with this thought. I mean, the economics of editing fiction are down to almost the razor thin margins of capitalism. That is what we've come down to. Even the editors at publishing houses probably don't have more than a week or two to spend with your work. And when something that is in itself about the art of stretching time is squeezed down to this level, we have to make new non-capitalist spaces where fiction can thrive again. It cannot in such an environment, where the rush to the bottom line in media is too strong and it's too squeezed. We have to make a more generous model where we ask people to contribute bits of time. Or now there's South Asia Speaks, this mentoring project where you can apply and you get paired up with a single writer. Those are wonderful. Imagine the company of someone 5 steps ahead of you for a year. That's brilliant. So that, I think, is a very ingenious answer to the problem. But where we are, it feels like the room is a bit small.
So there you have it. Writers and editors of the world unite. From Chandrahas Chaudhary. South Asia Speaks, for any young writers in the audience, is, of course, this is all in English. I think let's acknowledge that everything that we're saying is Anglophone fiction. Though I know that South Asia Speaks is also thinking about expanding into other languages, but if there are any young writers looking for mentorship, please look up South Asia Speaks online. It's a wonderful mentorship program of South Asian writers trying to help young South Asian writers break into the industry. With that, thank you so much to you both, and thank you especially to all of you. It's been a pleasure.
We should also thank Roman. I'm seeing him after maybe 9 or 10 years. And it's great to catch up together on stage, and thank you for, he really cut it fine by arriving 10 minutes before the event.
That was the flight, not
but,
me.
But you have clearly you are a very busy man because of your quality as an editor. Thank you so much, Roman.
Thank you, Chandrahas.